All right, welcome to another deep dive. You know, improving spoken English, something so many people are thinking about. You sent over an article that caught my eye. It's not just practical stuff, but like the whole cultural side of it, especially in India.
Yeah.
There are some really fascinating points about English in India, how powerful it is, and this myth of advanced English,
Right.
and even a bit about why self-study books maybe they're not the magic solution they seem.
Yeah, it struck me, this article really highlights just how important English has become in India. I
Hmm.
mean, it's woven into everything, the law, the government,
Yeah.
education, you name it, even jobs, obviously. And what's interesting, the article even points out that a lot of official stuff, documents and initiatives, they're in English.
It really does feel like if you've got those English skills, doors just open.
Yeah.
I had a friend who moved to Mumbai a few years back, and she was telling me her English, it was a game changer. I mean, she got this amazing job, connections just everywhere, all because she could communicate.
Absolutely. And that sort of gets at this interesting tension the article brings up. On one hand, India is pushing to promote its own incredible mix of languages.
Right.
But then on the other hand, you can't deny it, English is often the key if you want to get ahead in so many fields.
So true. Okay, let's get into some of these myths the article tackles. This one really stood out to me. Its take on self-study books.
Oh, yeah.
It basically says, those books that promise you'll be fluent, like overnight.
Yeah.
Total joke.
Yeah, I was laughing at that part too. The article nails it, though. You don't get fluent just by, memorizing grammar from a book, right?
Yeah.
You got to use it.
Exactly. And it's not all just individual effort either, right? The article points out how some societal pressures can make people hesitate about really embracing English.
Mhm.
This whole idea of like misplaced nationalism, some people feel like learning English means you're like betraying your own culture. Have you
Mhm.
run into that?
Oh, absolutely. I've talked to so many learners who grapple with this feeling of having to choose their own language versus English. But the article's point, and it's a good one, you don't have to abandon your culture to embrace a new language.
Yeah.
It's more like you're adding a new tool to your belt. You're expanding what you can do, who you can connect with.
So well put. Okay, let's get practical. The article had a bunch of tips for improving spoken English apps, online courses, even private coaching. It even mentioned word games.
Yeah, and it's not just like a random list.
Yeah.
The article actually gets into why certain methods might work better for different people, which I appreciate.
Yeah.
It really stresses reading English language newspapers and magazines.
That makes so much sense. It's almost like you're absorbing the language naturally without even realizing it.
Exactly. You're picking up grammar, vocabulary, how sentences actually flow. It's immersion.
But I mean, at some point, you can't just be passive, right? You've got to speak.
100%. And I think that's where so many people get stuck. That fear of messing up, being self-conscious about their accent, it's real.
So, any thoughts from the article on how to get over those hurdles? What did it say?
Well, the article really stressed finding a good environment for learning, a place where you're comfortable making mistakes. It even suggests, if you can, find chances to practice with native speakers. Super valuable.
Yeah, but I imagine that can feel intimidating, right? Did it say anything about like how to find those opportunities or approach those conversations?
Oh, for sure. One thing it suggested was online conversation groups or those language exchange programs.
Oh, right.
It's a good way to ease in, practice with other people who are learning too.
Hmm.
And honestly, it even said just narrate your day out loud in English. Might sound silly, but it gets you comfortable with the sounds, how the language feels.
That's a great point. Make it part of your everyday life. I'm curious, from what you've seen, what are some of the biggest mindset shifts that help people become more confident speaking English? What helps people break through?
Oh, one of the biggest. Letting go of this idea that there's perfect English. Even native speakers trip up. Actually, the article had a whole section on this about the myth of advanced English.
Oh, yeah, when I read that part, I was kind of thrown. What's that all about?
Basically, it's saying fluency is a spectrum, not like a finish line. You can always keep improving. The article makes it sound fun, too, keep learning by doing crosswords, word games. It's about enjoying the process, not stressing about some impossible standard of perfection.
Love that. That lifelong learner mindset. Speaking of which, I've got to admit, sometimes I still get tripped up by UK English versus US English.
Oh, yeah?
The article touched on it briefly, but what's your take? How do you navigate those differences? What do you tell people?
Honestly, consistency is key.
Hmm.
Pick one style and stick with it, especially if you're writing something formal. The article even suggests thinking of them like different dialects, each with its own little quirks.
That's a great way to look at it. Takes the pressure off feeling like you have to master both perfectly.
Exactly. Goes back to that idea of enjoying the language learning journey.
I'm so glad we dug into that. Okay, so we've covered a lot, but let's give our listeners some key takeaways, those concrete things they can do to improve their spoken English.
Absolutely. I think, first and foremost, remember, it's totally doable. It's all about finding those methods that click with you, making practice a regular thing. And don't be afraid to make mistakes. That's how you learn.
And like we talked about, don't let those societal pressures, those fears hold you back. Have fun with it. Get a good support system.
Totally. It's progress, not perfection.
All right, now, before we go on, something to think about. How can you take what we've talked about and actually apply it to your daily life? What are some creative ways you can practice speaking without feeling overwhelmed?
Maybe it's finding a conversation group online, starting a blog, even just talking to yourself in English. Like I said, there are tons of ways to do it.
And each step you take, even the little ones, they all add up.
It's true. Language learning has so many rewards, and it's never too late to start.
Such a good point. It really is never too late, is it? And speaking of things that open doors, the article had some interesting stuff about the job market in India and, how English skills can give you a real leg up.
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, one study the article mentioned actually found that people with strong English skills, they're earning like way more, significantly more than those who don't have that fluency. And it makes sense, right? Think about multinational companies. They often make English fluency a priority when they're hiring. Just makes it easier to communicate across teams all over the globe.
So it's not just like personal enrichment, it can have a real impact on your career.
Absolutely. And it goes beyond just getting your foot in the door too, right? You're more likely to get promoted, move into leadership roles, maybe even score some international travel or assignments if your English is strong.
Makes total sense. In today's world, if you can communicate on a global level, you're just like instantly more valuable. And the article also touched on how important English is becoming in fields like technology and innovation.
Oh, yeah, that's crucial. It points out how so much of the research, the publications, the cutting edge stuff, it's all in English.
Hmm.
If you want to keep up, you got to have those skills.
It really is the key to unlocking so much knowledge and like staying ahead of the curve. Now, when it comes to actually improving spoken English, the article mentioned reading English language newspapers and magazines. Any specific ones you'd recommend? Like, if someone's trying to build the vocabulary, get a feel for grammar, where should they start?
Well, it always depends, right? What are they interested in? What's their reading level like? For beginners, maybe something like the Times of India or the Hindu. Clear writing covers a lot of different topics.
Good starting points.
Yeah. And then as they progress, they could check out The Guardian, The New York Times, stuff like that. Bit more in-depth, wider vocabulary.
So start simple, challenge yourself as you go. Love it.
And don't just passively read, right? The articles suggest, like, really engage with it. Highlight new words, look them up, even try using them in conversation.
Turn it into a game almost.
Exactly. The more you expose yourself to real, authentic English, the more it'll just become second nature. And the article, it had this whole section about shedding inhibitions when speaking. Like, don't be afraid to actually speak the language.
Oh, I remember that about how the fear of messing up can be so paralyzing.
It's so true. And honestly, it's something I see all the time. People are so scared of being judged. But you got to let go of that. Everyone makes mistakes, even, native speakers.
It's so reassuring. I think we put so much pressure on ourselves to be perfect.
Yeah, and that's what stops us from actually improving. The article, it said something like, think of mistakes as, like, learning opportunities. Embrace them. Laugh them off.
It's about progress, not perfection, like we keep saying. Any tips on how to create that kind of environment where it's safe to make mistakes,
It suggested finding a language partner, maybe, or joining a conversation group. Practice in a low-pressure setting.
Yeah.
And just surround yourself with people who are supportive,
Your own little cheerleading squad.
Exactly. And celebrate those small wins, too. Used a new word. Understood a complicated sentence in a podcast. Those are victories.
Love it. Focus on the positive. Build that momentum. So, from your experience, what are some of the most common mistakes English language learners make? And how can they work through them? What helps?
One big one is verb tenses. English has a lot of them, and they can be tricky to master. The article suggested focusing on one tense at a time, practice it in different ways, build up your confidence.
Or get down into smaller chunks.
Exactly. And be patient. It takes time. And another thing that trips people up is pronunciation. Lots of learners feel self-conscious about their accent.
It's understandable.
Yeah, but everyone have an accent. It's part of what makes your voice you.
I love that. Celebrate that uniqueness.
Yeah, and don't get me wrong, clear pronunciation is important,
Mhm.
but don't let the pursuit of, like, the perfect accent stop you from actually speaking and expressing yourself.
Such good advice. Now, speaking of communication, the article had a fascinating section on UK English versus US English.
Oh, yeah, those differences can be tricky.
It suggested picking one style and sticking with it, but are there ever times when it's good to know both? What do you think?
Well, if you're going to be traveling or working in both places, it's definitely helpful to at least be aware of the differences, right?
Hmm.
Avoid confusion, navigate those social
It's
situations.
like a cultural decoder ring.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it just makes language learning more fun, right? The more you explore, the more confident you become.
I'm loving this conversation. So much good stuff. Okay, we've been through a lot, but for our listener who's trying to improve their spoken English, what are the key takeaways? What should they remember?
Okay, so the main thing, it's totally doable. It's about finding what worked for you, making practice a habit, and remembering that mistakes are part of the process.
And we can't forget, don't let those societal pressures or fears get in the way. Enjoy the journey, find your support system.
Progress over perfection, always.
Couldn't agree more. Now, before we move on, something to think about. How can you take all this and make it work in your everyday life? What are some creative ways to practice speaking without getting overwhelmed?
Maybe it's an online conversation group, a blog, even just narrating your day out loud, like we talked about.
Be creative.
Every little step counts.
That's right. The rewards are there, and it's never too late to start.
On that note, let's shift gears a bit. The article had this really intriguing point about how there's no such thing as, like, advanced English.
Now that's where things get interesting. Honestly, when I first heard that, I wasn't so sure. But the more I think about it, the more it makes sense.
Me too. I mean, how can there not be a ceiling, right?
Well, the article's argument is that language, it's always changing. Even native speakers are constantly learning. It's not about reaching some endpoint, it's about the journey. Always more to discover.
So it's like no matter how good you get, there's always room to grow.
Exactly. And it's a mindset shift, right? Instead of, I need to reach this level, it becomes, I'm enjoying the process. It's a much healthier approach, isn't it? It takes the pressure off.
For sure. And it opens up so many possibilities. You never hit a wall. There are always new challenges and new ways to stretch yourself.
I love that analogy. It's like language learning is a workout for your brain.
Exactly. And the article even had some fun suggestions for keeping that workout going. Things like crosswords, word games, even exploring different types of books and movies.
Oh, yeah, I remember. It made it sound like fun, not a chore.
It's all about finding those things that spark your interest and using them to fuel your learning.
Turn it into something you're passionate about.
Exactly. When you have that curiosity, that excitement, it doesn't feel like work anymore. It's an adventure.
Such a great way to look at it. So, we've talked about this idea of advanced English, but what about people who are just starting out? What would you tell them?
Well, first and foremost, be patient. It takes time and effort. Don't expect results overnight.
Yeah, I imagine it can feel overwhelming in the beginning. So many new rules, so many words to learn.
Absolutely. That's why it's so important to break down your goals. Start small. Maybe it's mastering the basic verb tenses or learning everyday vocabulary, one step at a time.
Set those realistic expectations, right?
Right.
And celebrate the wins along the way.
Exactly. And find those ways to make learning fun. The article mentioned apps, online courses, conversation groups.
Right. Find those resources and communities that fit your style.
Exactly. And try to incorporate English into your daily life. Watch movies, listen to music, read books, even talk to yourself in English.
Surround yourself with it.
Exactly. The more you do it, the easier it becomes.
So much good stuff. All right, before we wrap up, any key takeaways for our listener who wants to get better at speaking English?
Remember, it's achievable. Find the approaches you enjoy, make practice a habit, and don't be afraid of making mistakes.
Don't let those societal pressures or anxieties hold you back. Find a good support system, and remember, enjoy the journey.
Progress, not perfection.
Now, one last thing to think about before we go. How can you use all of these tips in your own life? How can you practice speaking in fun, creative ways without getting overwhelmed?
Maybe it's an online conversation group, starting a blog, narrating your day.
Mhm.
Get creative and find what works for you.
Every step brings you closer to your goal.
Language learning is filled with rewards, and it's never too late to start.
It really is. And one thing that struck me from the article was how it talked about the power of spoken English, like to connect people across different cultures.
Oh, yeah,
It really made a case for English as like a bridge, between different communities, different ways of seeing the world.
definitely. I mean, it even talked about how English has helped spread ideas, art, culture, all on a global scale.
That's what's so cool about language learning, right? It's not just a skill, it's like this whole new world opens up.
Absolutely. Understanding, empathy, breaking down those barriers, making connections with people from like all walks of life.
It really is a passport,
Oh,
to a richer, more connected world.
that's a great way to put it. And it made me think of that story the article shared about the Indian student who used her English to volunteer at an international conference.
Oh, yeah.
And just by talking to people from all these different countries, she gained so much. New insights, new perspectives, even made some lifelong friends.
Such a powerful example of how, like, language can empower you to make a difference, connect with people on a deeper level.
It is. And it shows how learning English, it's not just about you. It's about contributing to like a more inclusive world.
Totally. Like, by learning English, you're part of this bigger movement toward understanding and collaboration.
Exactly. And it brings us back to that idea of like there's no finish line with language learning. There's always something new to discover, more people to connect with.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive, I hope our listener is feeling, inspired to keep working on those spoken English goals.
Yeah, remember, it's a journey. Enjoy it, celebrate the little victories, and keep exploring the language.
And most importantly, have fun with it. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive. Keep those conversations flowing.